The dense, quiet woods of the Pacific Northwest are often a place for peace and solitude. But for one hiker, a routine trek through the trees would soon become something far darker. What started as a peaceful day in nature quickly turned to horror when the hiker stumbled upon something hidden just beneath the surface, a shallow grave. At first glance, it looked like any other, but a closer inspection revealed something that would haunt anyone who discovered it: the body of Marcellus Boyd, missing for 3 weeks. His hands were bound with paracord, his life taken by gunshot wounds that bore the unmistakable signs of a silencer. But there was something more, something eerily precise in the details that suggested Marcellus had been forced to walk, struggling with every step. His shoes left impressions in the dirt, marks that told a story of desperation and pain. As investigators began piecing together the evidence, the question remained: who would want to harm a man like Marcellus Boyd, and why? And what led to his brutal end in a lonely grave in the woods? This story isn't just about a body found in the dirt. It's about the search for answers, about the mysteries hidden in the smallest clues, and the connections that could lead to a killer. But what if those answers were hidden in plain sight? What if a single mistake, a seemingly insignificant detail, could reveal everything? Stay with us as we delve into this chilling case, uncovering the clues that will eventually lead to justice for Marcellus Boyd. Marcellus Boyd was the kind of person who made an impression the moment he walked into a room. Known for his generosity and quiet strength, he had a life that seemed grounded and full of promise. In his early 30s, Marcellus was a beloved son, a loyal friend, and a man with ambitions that reflected his passion for life. He had recently moved to the Pacific Northwest, hoping to escape the chaos of city life, and had settled into the serene landscape of the small town of Colton. Here, he immersed himself in the local hiking community, often exploring the vast wilderness in search of peace and solitude. But despite his calm demeanor, Marcellus had his own struggles, ones few knew about. His past was dotted with brief relationships and moments of uncertainty, which he kept to himself, never sharing the full weight of his thoughts with even those closest to him. While many of his friends were aware of his occasional quiet moods, none could have foreseen the events that would soon unfold. 3 weeks before his body was discovered, Marcellus had gone missing without a trace. His family grew desperate, and the search efforts escalated as days passed without a single lead. His car was found abandoned, but there were no signs of where he had gone. The suddenness of his disappearance left a deep sense of unease hanging over those who knew him, with no answers to explain his vanishing. As investigators began to connect the dots, they uncovered a network of clues that would eventually unravel the mystery of Marcellus Boyd's fate. But even now, some pieces remain unsolved. What led to his tragic end in the woods? And who could have wanted to harm a man so loved by his community? For more updates on this case and other gripping true crime stories, be sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. By subscribing, you'll join us in exploring the untold truths behind the headlines, as we search for justice and uncover the stories that lie beneath the surface.
Marcellus Boyd's life was intertwined with a small but close-knit group of family and friends, each playing a role in his journey. His parents, who had moved to the area seeking tranquility after years of urban life, were devastated by his disappearance. They described their son as a quiet, thoughtful person who always seemed to take on the weight of others' burdens. He wasn't the type to share personal struggles easily, preferring to carry his emotions privately. But those who knew him best recognized the occasional signs of inner turmoil, a subtle shift in his demeanor when something wasn't quite right. Marcellus also had a tight circle of friends, most of whom were fellow hikers and nature enthusiasts. Among them was his longtime friend, Daniel, who had known Marcellus since childhood. Daniel often described their friendship as a balance between camaraderie and distance, never overly personal, but deeply rooted in mutual respect. In the weeks leading up to Marcellus's disappearance, Daniel noticed some changes. Marcellus had seemed withdrawn, often canceling plans to go hiking or meet up. He became more private, and when asked if anything was wrong, he would simply shrug it off, insisting everything was fine. Then there was Emily, a woman who had been a friend of Marcellus's for several years. She had once hoped their friendship would evolve into something more, but it had remained platonic. She spoke of Marcellus with deep affection, noting his kindness and gentle spirit. However, Emily's concerns grew as their interactions became less frequent. She noticed his texts becoming shorter and his responses more delayed, a clear contrast to his usual attentive nature. It wasn't unusual for Marcellus to take time for himself, but this change, this sudden distance, felt different to Emily. The most intriguing relationship, however, was with Thomas, a man who had recently entered Marcellus's life. Thomas was a new acquaintance, someone Marcellus had met during a group hiking trip just a few months before his disappearance. Thomas was known to be somewhat of a loner, often keeping to himself at social gatherings and displaying a quick temper when provoked. While Marcellus had introduced him to the hiking community, Thomas's presence seemed to raise more questions than answers. Those who encountered him described him as intense, with an unpredictable nature that some found unsettling. Still, Marcellus had spoken of him in a positive light, even mentioning plans to hike with him on more than one occasion. But as Marcellus's behavior changed in the days leading up to his disappearance, the bond between the two men seemed to fray. It was in these tangled relationships, the ones that were full of unspoken tension and shifting dynamics, that the investigators would later look for clues. Marcellus's friends and family may have seen only the surface of his life, but beneath the calm exterior were potential cracks, each one suggesting a deeper, more complex story waiting to be unraveled. As the investigation continued, the detectives began to piece together more details about these relationships. But it would be the subtle clues in these dynamics that would eventually lead them down an unexpected path toward the truth. It was a cool morning when Marcellus Boyd's absence first became a cause for concern. His close-knit group of friends had been planning a weekend hike through the forest trails, a ritual they had come to cherish. But when the morning of the hike arrived and Marcellus didn't show up, no one thought much of it at first. After all, it wasn't unusual for him to cancel last minute or opt for some solitude. But as hours passed with no word, a subtle sense of unease began to settle in. The real alarm bells began ringing when Marcellus failed to show up for work the following day. His supervisor, accustomed to his punctuality, reached out, expecting the usual apology and quick explanation. But this time, there was nothing. No response to texts, no missed calls. Marcellus had always been reliable, his work ethic admired by those around him. His sudden and unexplained absence was out of character, a stark departure from the person everyone knew. His colleagues and friends began to question, was something wrong, or had Marcellus simply decided to disappear for a while? His family grew even more worried after they discovered his car parked at a local trailhead, its keys left inside. It was a disconcerting find, as Marcellus had always been meticulous about locking his car. But there was no sign of him. No indication of where he had gone or why he had left so abruptly. The investigators would later learn that the missing persons report, filed by his parents after a few days of silence, was only the beginning of a series of strange events. Days turned into a week, and still, there was no word from Marcellus. His phone had been turned off, and the search efforts had yielded no answers. His friends, family, and the local authorities scoured the surrounding woods, hoping to find some trace of him, but the search proved fruitless. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when the police received a call from a hiker reporting a suspicious find, that the pieces began to fall into place. As detectives reviewed the information, they began to see a pattern emerge, one that had gone unnoticed by the people closest to Marcellus. The early warning signs had been there all along: subtle changes in his behavior, an unusual lack of communication, and the abandonment of his car in a place he frequented. But it wasn't until they connected these signs with the discovery of his body that the true horror of the situation began to unfold. The search for answers had begun in earnest, but the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that Marcellus's disappearance was anything but accidental. The pieces were now starting to come together, slowly but surely, and the truth was more chilling than anyone had imagined. The moment the hiker made the call to authorities, everything changed. It was a discovery that would lead to the unraveling of a mystery that had gripped the town for weeks. The hiker, an experienced adventurer familiar with the area, had been following one of the many trails when something unusual caught his eye. At first, it appeared to be an odd, unnatural depression in the earth, not quite a burial, but something that didn't belong. Upon closer inspection, he realized what he had found: a shallow grave, hastily dug, with the remains of a man covered by only a thin layer of dirt. The ground was disturbed, not recently, but enough to raise suspicion. The victim was soon identified as Marcellus Boyd, whose disappearance had been reported nearly 3 weeks earlier. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the community, and the weight of what had been discovered began to settle in. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a murder investigation. When investigators arrived at the scene, they were struck by the grim details surrounding Marcellus's final moments. His body, though partially decomposed, still showed signs of a violent death. His hands were bound tightly with paracord, the same type of cord commonly used in hiking and camping, which suggested a methodical approach to his abduction. The position of his body, his legs spread awkwardly and his arms tied behind his back, suggested that he had been placed in the grave after a struggle, possibly while still alive. The investigators took note of the gunshot wounds, each one precise, but there was something unnerving about the nature of the injuries. The bullets had entered his body at close range, but it was a lack of noise that made these shots stand out. The use of a suppressor, something designed to muffle the sound of gunfire, pointed to a chilling conclusion. The killer had intended to remain undetected. Whoever had killed Marcellus had taken great care to avoid attracting attention. A closer examination of the grave site revealed another disturbing detail. Shoe impressions surrounded the area, some clearer than others. What caught the detective's attention was the staggered nature of the prints. They weren't in a straight line, as one would expect from a person walking with ease. Instead, they showed a limp, a deliberate, uneven gait. This was no random pattern. It suggested that the person who had carried out the crime had been injured, likely recently. Perhaps even the perpetrator was in pain. As investigators sifted through the ground near the grave, they found small pieces of debris that had been dislodged during the digging process. A thread of nylon fiber caught in the brush was the first clue that gave the detectives hope. The fiber looked out of place, its bright color stark against the natural surroundings. Upon closer inspection, it was matched to a specific type of truck bed liner. The fibers were a perfect match to the debris found in the victim's clothing, confirming what had initially been a hunch. The killer had transported Marcellus in a vehicle. With this new evidence, the investigation began to shift its focus. The detectives now turned to hospital records, seeking any link that could tie a potential suspect to the area or the timeline of Marcellus's disappearance. It wasn't long before they found a breakthrough. Just a day after Marcellus was last seen, a man had been treated at the local emergency room for a leg injury, an injury that would explain the limp shown in the shoe impressions around the grave. The man had registered for emergency care, but his name didn't appear in the usual patient logs. The records were incomplete, but a detailed search eventually uncovered that the individual had a history of minor infractions and was known to have been involved in an altercation in the area where Marcellus was last seen. The clues were now piling up, each one more telling than the last. It became clear that Marcellus had been taken by someone familiar with the terrain, someone who had planned the abduction carefully. The injury to the suspect's leg added another layer of mystery. How did Marcellus end up in the hands of someone who had been injured in the process? Was it a crime of opportunity, or was it something more personal? And who could have wanted to harm Marcellus Boyd, a man who had left behind no obvious enemies? The detectives, armed with this growing body of evidence, knew that they were on the verge of something significant. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the most crucial part of the investigation still lay ahead, the identification of the person behind this brutal crime. The discovery of Marcellus Boyd's body sent shockwaves through the small town of Colton, leaving behind a trail of grief and disbelief. For his parents, the confirmation of his death was a crushing blow, one they had feared but could not fully prepare for. Marcellus had been their only son, a person they had watched grow from a curious child into a thoughtful adult. Now, they were left to grapple with the heartbreaking reality that he had been taken from them in such a violent and untimely manner. Their sorrow was palpable, each passing day a reminder of the pain they could not escape. But their grief was soon mixed with anger as they began to question who could have done this to their son, and why. Marcellus's friends, particularly Daniel, Emily, and Thomas, found themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions. For Daniel, the loss was a bitter pill to swallow, as he had known Marcellus for most of his life. Their friendship had been one of mutual understanding, quiet and steady. But now, in the wake of Marcellus's death, Daniel couldn't help but replay every conversation, every moment, wondering if there had been signs he had missed, something he could have done to help. The guilt was overwhelming, though he knew rationally that nothing could have prepared him for this. Emily, too, was devastated. She had always admired Marcellus for his gentle nature, but as his closest friend in recent years, she had started to notice his increasing withdrawal. The sudden change in his behavior, the silence, the distance, haunted her, and she found herself racked with self-doubt. Could she have noticed something sooner? Should she have reached out, done more to understand what was troubling him? The questions lingered, unanswered, as she struggled with her emotions. In the quiet of her home, she wondered if she had missed some crucial clue, something that might have shed light on why Marcellus had been so isolated in the days leading up to his disappearance. For Thomas, the grief was complicated. Although he had known Marcellus for only a short time, their bond had seemed strong. Now, as the investigation turned toward possible suspects, Thomas found himself under scrutiny. As the only person in Marcellus's life who had recently been involved in a physical altercation, he had quickly become a person of interest for the detectives. Yet, beyond the tense relationship that seemed to have developed between the two men, there was little else that connected Thomas to the crime. At least, not yet. As the investigation ramped up, the town's community also felt the impact of Marcellus's murder. Colton was a place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors greeted one another with familiarity and warmth. The crime that had struck so close to home left many questioning their safety, wondering how such violence could have occurred in a place so seemingly untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The feeling of unease was pervasive. The quiet woods that had once been a refuge for locals now tinged with suspicion and fear. The detectives, too, were feeling the weight of their task. The case had quickly gained attention, not just locally but nationally, and the pressure to solve the mystery before it could slip through their fingers was mounting. Every new piece of evidence, from the truck bed liner fibers to the matching hospital records, was like a thread pulling the investigation tighter. Yet, despite the progress, the detectives still faced the daunting task of narrowing down the list of suspects. The clues were piling up, but the picture was far from complete. Meanwhile, the community was left to wrestle with their own reactions: grief, confusion, anger, and fear. But the true depth of the impact was felt most acutely by those who had known Marcellus best. As they tried to make sense of the senseless, they clung to the hope that justice would come, that the person responsible for taking him from them would be held accountable. Yet, deep down, they knew that nothing could bring him back. As the weeks passed, the investigation into Marcellus Boyd's motive slowly began to take shape, with the mounting evidence pushing the case forward. Each new lead brought the detectives closer to the truth, but it was the seemingly small details, those overlooked by the casual observer, that began to crack the case wide open. One of the first breakthroughs came from the forensic analysis of the crime scene. The fibers found near the grave, matched to the truck bed liner, had given the detectives their first solid lead. Though the truck had been registered to a local man, there were no immediate connections between him and Marcellus. But as investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the suspect's name had come up before, in a completely unrelated context. Thomas, the new acquaintance Marcellus had met through hiking, was linked to this truck. He was known to have used it on several occasions, often transporting camping gear for extended trips into the woods. The truck, it seemed, had been more than just a means of transport. It was now a crucial piece of evidence. The detectives carefully analyzed the records of Thomas's recent activities and traced his movements around the time of Marcellus's disappearance. Hospital records had already shown that Thomas had sought emergency care for a leg injury just a day after Marcellus vanished. The injury, which was initially thought to be minor, now appeared far more significant. The limp indicated in the shoe impressions found at the crime scene was consistent with the type of injury Thomas had sustained. This discovery turned out to be a critical detail, one that linked Thomas directly to Marcellus's final moments. The breakthrough was nothing short of significant. Armed with this new information, the investigators began to focus their efforts on corroborating the timeline, trying to piece together exactly what had transpired. By cross-referencing Thomas's medical history with witness statements, they pieced together a picture of his movements in the days following Marcellus's disappearance. Thomas had been seen near the trailhead the day Marcellus went missing. His truck, along with the peculiar pattern of shoe impressions, seemed to form a clear path leading from the scene of the crime to a secluded part of the forest, where Marcellus's body was later found. As they investigated further, the detectives uncovered a series of inconsistencies in Thomas's statements. While he had initially denied any involvement with Marcellus in the days leading up to the disappearance, surveillance footage soon revealed something else entirely. Thomas had been in contact with Marcellus at several points leading up to the hike. This discovery added a layer of complexity to the case. What had initially seemed like a random encounter now appeared to be far more personal. The detectives began to focus on the motive. While Marcellus had no known enemies, his growing isolation in the days before his disappearance had raised questions. Was it possible that Thomas had become involved with Marcellus in a more intimate way? And if so, could that have been the catalyst for the murder? As they uncovered more about Thomas's past, his violent tendencies, his temper, and his strange behavior, the possibility of a darker connection between the two men began to emerge. It seemed that Thomas had more to hide than anyone had realized. One critical piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Marcellus's phone. Though the phone had been turned off at the time of the disappearance, investigators were able to retrieve the data. It revealed several text messages between Marcellus and Thomas, some of which hinted at a growing tension. The final message was chilling, one that suggested a confrontation was inevitable. It was unclear what exactly had transpired during their final encounter, but the implication was undeniable. Whatever had happened, it had gone terribly wrong. As the puzzle pieces began to fall into place, the investigators were left with more questions than answers. Why had Thomas acted so violently? What had pushed him to kill a man who had been nothing but a friend? Was it jealousy, anger, or something more? The answers were still out of reach, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Every clue pointed back to Thomas, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he had been involved in Marcellus's death in one way or another. With mounting evidence, the detectives knew that they were getting closer to closing in on Thomas. The tension was palpable as they prepared for the next phase of the investigation, bringing the suspect in for questioning. But even as they readied their case, they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was still more to the story. The consequences of Marcellus Boyd's murder were felt far beyond the small town of Colton. For his family, the pain of losing their son was immeasurable. The grief of his parents, still fresh and raw, was compounded by the knowledge that their son's death had been brutal, violent, and senseless. Marcellus had been taken from them without warning, and though the investigators were closing in on the person responsible, the damage had already been done. No conviction or arrest could ever fill the hole left in their hearts, nor could it undo the trauma they now carried. For his friends, the impact was just as profound. Daniel, Emily, and even Thomas were left to reckon with their own feelings of guilt, confusion, and sorrow. Though Daniel and Emily had done everything they could to support their friend, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. Some piece of information that could have saved Marcellus from the tragic fate that befell him. And Thomas, despite his increasing involvement as a suspect, had been emotionally entangled in the tragedy, making the process of understanding his actions all the more complicated. The suspicion surrounding him only added to the emotional burden the town was already carrying. The realization that someone so close to Marcellus could be responsible for his death was a bitter pill to swallow. As the investigation drew to a close and Thomas was arrested, there was a sense of bittersweet relief among those who had been affected by Marcellus's death. Justice seemed within reach, but it did little to ease the pain of loss. In the end, the case raised questions about human nature, the complexities of relationships, and the capacity for violence that can sometimes lie hidden beneath the surface. What had pushed Thomas to kill Marcellus? Was it a deep-seated jealousy, a momentary lapse in judgment, or something darker and more personal? The answers, though becoming clearer with each revelation, could never truly explain the magnitude of the loss. The town of Colton would never be the same after Marcellus's murder. The quiet woods that had once been a place of refuge now held a dark secret, one that would forever mark the landscape. But as life slowly returned to normal, the people of Colton were left with a lingering sense of unease. The case may have been solved, but the emotional scars it left behind would take much longer to heal. As we reflect on this case, we invite you, our viewers, to share your thoughts. What do you think pushed Thomas to commit such a heinous act? Was there something in Marcellus's life that we missed, something that could have pointed to the truth earlier? How do you think this case will impact the community moving forward? Leave your thoughts and comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more investigations, as we continue to uncover the truths hidden beneath the surface.